My name is Carolyn Gould. I'm president of the Chittenden County Historical Society, and we hold these talks. Hello, Diana. We hold these talks about every other month, and I think we're not going to hold any more in December. We either have very few people or we have a lot of people, and it's just hard for people to get around. So I think we're going to have them mostly from September to November from now on. I want to welcome you. Most of you know that the Chittenden County Historical Society is a content-driven organization, which means we don't have a place. What we do is we do publications, some of which are on sale over there. The 3-volume historic guide to Burlington neighborhoods, for example. And we also publish every other month a bulletin, which has original research of local topics in Chittenden County. And we give out research grants every year on original ideas about local history. And so we have people from all over Chittenden County apply for these, and we've supported a number of people in these efforts. I'd urge you to become a member if you're not already. Membership's very inexpensive, and you help to support this because all of us are volunteers and all of our money goes to these kinds of research efforts. One of the things I wanted to talk about was next year, 2025, is our 60th anniversary. And we have a number of things planned, some surprises. One of the things we're going to do is to publish a bigger issue of our bulletin than we normally do and try to bring back some of the good essays that were in the past. So instead of being 10 pages long, it might be 40. So it's a good year to join. And you can look for us at our website, cchsvt.org, or on Facebook. One of the things I wanted to do before I turn this over to Elizabeth Allen, who is our program director, is to say a few things about land trusts, because it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. When I moved to Vermont, I had been here off and on for years, but when I finally moved here, I became a Vermont master naturalist. So I am out in the woods all the time, one place or another, usually within 15 minutes from where I am in Winooski. The other thing is I was a conservationist in my home state, which is Oregon. At 8 years old, I became an Oregon Green Guard and started planting trees in the 350,000 square mile acre burn that was in what is now the Tillamook National Forest. As we'd go to the Oregon coast, I'd cry every time, and I was like, I need to do something about this as a 7-year-old. So I became an Oregon Green Guard, planting trees. And so I've sort of been doing that my whole life, which I guess is probably a pretty common story. I don't know. Anyway, also, Sarah Dopp, who for a long time was a part of the Chittenden County Historical Society, died suddenly in March. And she was the founder of the South Burlington Land Trust. And Janet, would you like to say something about what you had planned for Sarah? Would you like to come up here?
Sure. This is very impromptu. I just met Carolyn and we were talking. My name is Janet Bellavance, and I'm a board member of the South Burlington Land Trust. And last part of our origin, Sarah was our president and founder of the organization, and she passed, and we were both really struggling with keeping our organizations running. And this past Tuesday, I'm proud to announce that the city of South Burlington and the Vermont Land Trust closed on a conservation easement on Wheeler Nature Park. It was started in 2008, so that gives you a sense of how long it took to pull that together. And it's actually part of our origin story of the South Burlington Land Trust. They were going to build a police station there at the corner of Swift and Dorset Street. And Sarah had said, just as an individual, might there be a better place than using this beautiful historical open land here. And so really put an ad in the paper saying, like-minded people, let's get together and talk. And so that's how it started. So land trusts can start very grassroots, and it takes time for good work to happen, but we really honored her memory when we signed on Tuesday, when the Jesse Baker, our city manager, and the Vermont Land Trust conserved that permanently.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, great news. Yes. So I just have one short thing to say before I give this over, because it involves one of my big heroes, personal heroes. 2024 is an amazing year. The UVM celebrated its 50th anniversary for its stewardship program, and they had a big program a couple weeks ago about that. What's interesting about that is Vermont has the first public land that was preserved in the United States. It predates the Yosemite National Park by 5 years. In 1859, the summit of Mount Mansfield was preserved by the university president, Pease. And on his board was my hero, who, can anybody guess who that was? Is? George Perkins Marsh, who is the true father of the environmental movement in the United States. Not all these other guys, but George Perkins Marsh. And I'm going to somehow make him as well known as John Muir and Rachel Carson and all these other people. He and Alexander von Humboldt are probably the two most amazing people, polyglots, both of them, Renaissance people, even though they were 18th century Enlightenment figures, but truly remarkable. Anyway, his book of Man and Nature was published in 1859. It's in its 160th anniversary. So with that, may I introduce Elizabeth?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Elizabeth Allen. I am the head of programming for Chittenden County Historical Society, and today's panel is Land Trusts in Chittenden County. And we have, today's panelists include Darby Bradley of the Vermont Land Trust, who's going to kind of give us an introduction, an overview to land trusts in Vermont, kind of their historical context and their importance. We have Kate Lampton of the Charlotte Land Trust, who's going to provide more of a, I say case study, but more of like an example of like a local land trust in action, talking about the history, accomplishments, and plans of CLT. And we also have Livy Strong, who's going to tell us the story of the Jericho Underhill Land Trust. So Darby Bradley helped to create the Vermont Land Trust in 1977 and the Lake Champlain Land Trust in 1978. He served as president of Vermont Land Trust from 1990 to 2007, and then as VLT's Special Assistant for Donor and Government Relations until 2013. According to the latest annual report, VLT has conserved over 10% of the state area in partnership with state agencies, conservation organizations, and local land trusts like Charlotte Land Trust and Jericho Underhill Land Trust. Darby and his wife live in Montpelier. And so I'm just going to introduce all the people first. So Kate Lampton is a resident of Charlotte. She is the president of the board of directors of Charlotte Land Trust. Founded in 1986, CLT became a nonprofit organization in 1995. And since then, it has obtained conservation easements on over 500 acres of local land, which is monitored by the organization's stewardship program. We have Livy Strong, a Jericho resident, who is president of the board of directors of Jericho Underhill Land Trust. Jericho Underhill Land Trust was founded in 1989 and has conserved over 2,000 acres in the last decade. Jericho Underhill Land Trust also owns and stewards almost 800 acres in Jericho, Richmond, and Bolton. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Darby. So you can either come up here or
I'll stand there. That's okay.
Great, thank you so much.
Should I leave this open? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nice to be here. I arrived in Vermont 50 years ago this summer. And at that time, land conservation, land trusts and conservation easements were virtually unknown. The Nature Conservancy was active here, and they acquired land mostly outright, either for state ownership or UVM or as natural areas and preserves. Very early on, within the first few months, I met a guy named Rick Carbon, who was the executive director of the Ottaquechee Regional Planning Commission. And Rick was a visionary. He had started a housing organization. He was interested in starting a land trust. He's also interested in starting an economic development organization. He was the first land trust person I knew that kind of put those things together. And as you heard, that we were started as the Ottaquechee Regional Land Trust in 1977. And they decided, so we wouldn't compete with the Nature Conservancy, decided to focus on productive lands, farmland and forest land, and so-called community projects, whatever that happened to be. I was involved in doing the legal work to set it up, but I wasn't on staff. And lots of things have happened in 50 years, but I'd mention three things that I think really formed how the land trust grew and how the land conservation movement in Vermont grew. The first was a project in Teignmouth. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, Rick and I were looking for some way to get the state of Vermont involved in the land conservation game. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut all had conservation easement programs to protect farmland. Vermont did not. It had actually authorized state agencies and municipalities to use conservation easements back in '68, 10 years earlier. It had never been used. The state had developed this list of criteria that almost ensured it would never be used. I don't remember the whole list of 10, but two of them were the land had to be under imminent threat of development, and you had to allow public recreational access over it all. So, but it turned out, what we figured out was that the real concern that the state agencies had was the cost of acquiring these conservation easements and then looking after them. The legal work, the negotiation with landowners, the title work, the title insurance, all that stuff, major expense up front, but long term was that you have to look after it and enforce it if there's violations. And they were concerned that if budgets got cut, they'd either have to give up the easements or they'd have to give up something in their program. So Rick and I said, well, look, the land trust can do the acquisition. We can do the stewardship. But it would be great. We're a very young organization. We conserved all of 6 acres of land in our first 3 years. That's not much of a track record. And if there's a major violation, we want to be sure that we have the backing at court, which was the Attorney General's office. So then we were looking around for a project which was so compelling that the state, if it said no to that, was saying no to the idea. And that showed up in Teignmouth. It was 1,200 acres, a 250-acre working farm, about 500 acres under forest management of the New England Forestry Foundation, and kind of a small 300-acre wilderness of Teignmouth Gulf. And that was the one that after a lot of discussion, the state said, okay, we will co-hold this easement with you. And that model became the form used 7 years later with the creation of the Housing Conservation Trust Fund. And that's the second thing that was that in the mid-'80s, when there was a lot of froth in the land market here, the housing trusts, which are very new to the scene, and the land trust realized they were both fighting the same rapidly rising land market. And they both needed some state funding, which they could leverage to accomplish their missions. So we came together to form a housing and conservation coalition. And the idea was so ridiculous because housing cancels out open space, and open space precludes housing. But if you think of the bigger picture, that like Rick Carbon was doing, it's what a community needs. It needs both of those and a bunch of other things as well. The idea was so appealing to Madeline Kunin, who was governor, and then to the legislature, that they appropriated $3 million for it in '87 and 20 million in 88, and off we were. It took a while for landowners, especially farmers. They were skeptical about these folks from Montpelier, but gradually, over time, as some people stepped forward, it began to really happen, and that led to what really happened in the 90s and in the early 2000s, which is land conservation became part of the land use system in the state of Vermont. It became institutionalized in a way that I think is almost unlike anywhere else in the country. At the beginning, we were trying to sell the idea to landowners, and if we got through to the landowners, we had to deal with their skeptical lawyers. And there were many myths about land conservation. One is your property taxes in town are going to go through the roof if you put conservation easements on land. Nobody will buy conserved land. No bank will lend money on conserved land. But over time, the myths have disappeared. And in fact, realtors, appraisers, bankers, lawyers had to understand what it really was and was not, just to advise their clients. So the myths have gradually disappeared. Same time, support for the Housing Conservation Board has continued. Senator Patrick Leahy came along and invented the farmland protection law. It's now the farm and ranch land protection that provided federal money to leverage state funds. There was the Forest Legacy program that he helped create. Howard Dean became governor in 1991 when Governor Snelling died, and he stayed 11 years, and he made land conservation one of his top priorities for his administration. And then a number of major foundations, John Merck Fund, the Freeman Foundation, and the High Meadows Fund poured tens of millions of dollars into land conservation over a 15-year period. And with all of that activity, a lot got done, and it really became part. It wasn't just a fringe player in the land use scene, it was a central part of it. Now, I just make a few final observations. One is, with success becomes added responsibility. The real genius behind the idea of a housing conservation board is it made us think outside of our own particular silo and box. We had to think about what the community needs. What land should not be conserved, because that's better suited for other kinds, for housing development or commercial development. If you conserve land in the wrong place, the pressure for development doesn't go away, it just gets moved out. So you may be contributing to sprawl rather than limiting sprawl. So you have to think about that. In some towns, in Addison County particularly, the percentages are over 25, even 35%. Town of Lewis is 100% conserved, but nobody lives there, so it's part of the champion lands. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a lot of money from foundations available, and you could do a lot of projects in a great hurry, and with some community involvement, but not central community involvement. That has changed. And on the downside, it takes more effort and time to get a big project done. On the plus side is the community feels a sense of ownership and pride in what is accomplished, and you'll talk to that, I'm sure. And that sets up relationships within that community that will last on to the future. And I think that's really good. I'm about to stop. Long term, the biggest challenge in land conservation is stewardship, looking after the lands and the conservation easements. Land conservation is a partnership between a landowner and a land trust, where the land trust is standing in for the landowner who can't stay forever. And that partnership continues. The day after the papers are signed, we don't become the conservation police. We're still partners. And yes, some violations occur, usually by mistake, and they're quickly cleaned up. But when the land ownership changes, you lose that partnership. And if you don't want to become the conservation police, you've got to go out proactively, try to build and maintain a partnership relationship with the future owners, which is really worthwhile. So you stay out of court. And so that's a big thing. But the big challenge down the road within stewardship is, what do you do with change? Think about what a farm easement would have looked like in 1824. And think about how relevant that easement might be to a farm, Polly Wickham, your farm, and the farm in Williston. And now project yourself 200 years into the future. And there are things that we didn't think about, that we may have overlooked, that we could have thought about. But there are many things that we would never even could possibly conceive. And so I think down the road, we're going to have to confront this issue of how do we deal with changes of all types in a way that honors what the landowners did and what society did at the beginning, but makes the necessary adjustments to really keep that farm in operation or keep that piece of land ecologically viable. And I think that's the big one. But that's a big conversation for another day. So, thank you.
Thanks so much. Now we have Kate Lampton to talk about Charlotte Land Trust.
Good afternoon. So Charlotte Land Trust is an all-volunteer organization, and except for a very short time in our early history when we did have staff, we're all volunteer today as well. We have 12 board members. We hold 16 easements that are about 750 acres. We've got 2 projects underway that, when completed, will add another 100 acres to that count. One of the key things in our history and our success has been that we've had a very strong history of partnering with other land trusts, principally the Vermont Land Trust, also the Lake Champlain Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy. And as a small local, as a small local all-volunteer land trust, without those partnerships, we really couldn't have accomplished as much as we have, or been able to assist as much as we've been able to. In the mid-1980s, the Charlotte Land Trust was formed in 1986. And the mid-1980s, there were several things going on that really came together to have a pretty profound impact, not only on Charlotte Land Trust and conservation, but really the way we see Charlotte today. One of those things is that the Planning Commission undertook a very comprehensive rewrite of the town plan. And a part of the process was to set up some study groups, one of which was on farming, made up of both farmers and townspeople. It was a great group. They came up with a lot of good suggestions, a lot of good things to consider. And one thing they did bring up that they thought we really needed to do was have a land trust in Charlotte. Being a very energetic group, they went ahead and founded one. And here we are today. Another thing happened in the mid-1980s, and that was, and Darby alluded to it, it was just this huge increase in development, and especially the interest in development in Charlotte. It was kind of like we'd been discovered. And if you look at a graph showing the development trend over the past 40 or 50 years in Charlotte, the mid-1980s are at the peak, and that has not been achieved again. The third thing that really came into play in the mid-1980s that had quite an impact was a federal program called the Whole Herd Buyout. This was a federal program to address the overproduction of milk throughout the United States. And the program, in essence, paid farmers to quit milking. Several of the large farms in Charlotte took advantage of the program, quit milking, and in very many instances retired and or sold their land. So the mid-1980s put us at the perfect storm of a fledgling land trust, tremendous development pressure, and a whole lot of very nice land on the market. In the mid-1990s, another very important aspect or occurrence that's had a lot of success for us is the establishment of the Charlotte Conservation Fund. This is a town fund that makes grants for conservation programs, projects in Charlotte. The Charlotte Land Trust was key to getting that established and funded and underway. And still what we do is help out by giving the select board every budget season a recommendation of money that should be added to the fund based on what we see in the pipeline for more projects. And I can't overstate how important that fund has been, not only to provide money for projects, but it also provides leverage and match money for the larger fundings, such as through Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. The fund has helped conserve about 2,000 acres. So the map that I'm going to show, or that's up here, is I was pulling together some photos to show, and they were actually they were pretty, but they were generic. And I think this pretty much sums up the status and the history of conservation in Charlotte. It's a map that we update every year with the town planning office. The land in green is land that's under a conservation easement. And that's either the Charlotte Land Trust, the Vermont Land Trust, Nature Conservancy, or the Lake Champlain Land Trust. And the green represents 20% of the land acres in Charlotte. The pink is another type of land protection method. It's called an open space agreement. Open space agreements are a product of subdivisions that are classified as one where you put together, clusters is sort of a dirty word sometimes in Vermont, but where you get lots configured in such a way that it leaves open space that's available. An open space agreement is not as strong as a conservation easement, but it does help give some protection. If you add the pink and the green areas together, 30% of the land acres in Charlotte are protected by either of those mechanisms. Originally, Charlotte Land Trust was focused primarily on agricultural land, which is no surprise given the factors that I talked about that happened in the mid-1980s, and also the fact that historically Charlotte has been a farming town. In the 20th century, almost exclusively dairy, and even a strong farming town today, even though dairy is down to one dairy farm in town. But even though we have focused a lot on farmland, we still are very active in conserving forest land, wildlife habitat, wildlife corridors, wetlands, water courses, and waterways. And those could be some really interesting projects. We're doing more of those, and especially in the past few years. One in particular that's our most recent forest project, that's sort of a good example of what we do, is 90 acres in East Charlotte that was conserved. This property is in the southeastern quadrant of Charlotte, which is very different than the western side of town. That part of Charlotte is really what's sort of the first hint of the Green Mountain foothills. It's also heavily forested. And this project that we helped conserve was special in and of itself, but even more importantly, it was part of a forested block that runs from approximately Shelburne Pond down to Raven Ridge. There's been quite a bit of concentration of conservation effort in that area. And this piece adds another part of that block. One of the things that's really, I think, very exciting about this type of project, the forest project, is the importance of connectivity in protecting this kind of land for both forest purposes and for habitat. And while we get a certain bang for the buck with that individual project, it's adding to a larger block that really adds tremendously to the value of the project. So it really, in essence, leverages each parcel sort of as a force multiplier, if you will, for the next and the next. So we hope to really keep concentrating on those types of projects, because slowly but surely, as we build those connected conservation areas, it really becomes more and more important. So in addition to our conservation work, we also do projects periodically. The most recent one is a farm study that we did with the Center for Rural Studies at UVM. We wanted to do the farm study largely to sort of fact check what we thought we were seeing with farms and farming in Charlotte. And the study did confirm what we thought, that conservation is critically important to farming in Charlotte. We took this map, and with the study, we added where farms were located. And seeing the juxtaposition of those two, you can see that the majority, I think, of farms that are still active in Charlotte take place on conserved land. Another thing that was really a little bit of a surprise and very gratifying to hear was that the average age of farmers in Charlotte is younger than both the national and the statewide average. This is particularly important, not only for us, but statewide and nationally, because there's been a concern for several years now about the increasing average age of farmers in the country and where that next generation will be that will take over farming. It was great to see that in Charlotte, although I won't say we've solved the problem, we're making headway. We have a lot of young farmers coming to Charlotte, and if I think of the past several projects that I've done, largely with Al leading the way for Vermont Land Trust, I think most of those are young farmers who are buying their first farm. And that's really great to see. And it could not have happened in any way, shape, or form if that land wasn't conserved, because the land is just too expensive for that type of use. So that's a quick look at the Charlotte Land Trust, but a larger kind of long-term perspective. I was sitting at my desk a few days ago and thinking about that mid-1980s period of intense development and a lot of land available. And thinking of what that landscape I was looking at would look like today without conservation. I live on the southwest slope of Mount Philo, so what I look out at is a very large swath of the Champlain Valley, it seems like. And what I look at is that iconic Vermont landscape of a patchwork of field and forest. And in thinking about what that might have looked like if we hadn't had the Vermont Land Trust, the Charlotte Land Trust, I was reminded of a planning commission hearing back in the mid-1980s, that period, as I mentioned, when we were over the top busy with development. I had the very dubious privilege of being head of the planning commission then. And we were one night having a hearing on some farmland and trying to gently nudge the developer into maybe turning some of the final result into some of that pink area. Now, while the debate was going on, a man raised his hand and asked if he could speak, and he said, "I don't know why you're bothering to try to save any of this, because in 20 years, there will be no farms in Charlotte." And I think if you had polled the planning commission that evening, we probably all would have thought, well, that could be. But as I looked out my window that day, I realized that with conservation as a large factor, that prediction did not come true.
Thank you so much, Kate. And now we will go to Jericho Underhill Land Trust.
Okay,
As presented by Livy Strong.
no problem. I'll just get my chair out of the way.
Probably want to go around that way.
Yeah, I will.
So you can just move the slides there, or just, click your finger.
Is it okay if I move this?
Yeah, that's not.
Okay. Hello, Livy Strong, Jericho Underhill Land Trust. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to share some of the miracles that we've been involved with. And as Kate mentioned, it can't happen without a strong partnership, in many cases with the Vermont Land Trust. So it's great to see Darby here and Al as well. How can miracles happen? And that's what I call land conservation. It's a miracle because it takes a willing landowner, it takes a strong, supportive community, and it takes a land trust. And if it all comes together, we get some projects done. And both the Charlotte Land Trust, Vermont Land Trust, and your local Jericho Underhill Land Trust, we've been excited to see wonderful things happen over these many years. I'm going to be sharing some of our miracles with you. I'm excited to do that. I'm not a techie person, so bear with me here. I think I can do this. Miracles are the ways that we can keep treasured landscapes available for generations, and it is a real partnership. I'm going to say a little bit about our land trust. It's similar to the Charlotte Land Trust. We're all volunteer. We've been around for about 24 years. We're a nonprofit. We're supported strictly through memberships. There's no state funding. There's no town funding. So every year, we depend on our residents of Jericho and Underhill primarily to support us. Our budget is around $20,000 a year, so we're small, but mighty. And we do a lot of fundraising as well as reaching out to grow our membership and our board. Let me see, hold on. Here we go. A little bit about us. We focus on working landscapes, that could be forest and farm, also scenic vistas and wildlife habitats. We were founded in 1989, and as I mentioned, we're all volunteer. We also own about 800 acres, 2 large properties. We work with the community on community projects, and I've got a few to show you. I'm excited to share. These are all miracles. Old Mill Park was conserved in 1990. It's 12.5 acres. It's owned by the Winooski Valley Park District. It's in Jericho behind the old Red Mill, if you're familiar with Jericho. Mills Riverside Park is a centerpiece of Jericho and Underhill, 216 acres, conserved in 1999. And we have farmers market, we have sports, we have hiking trails, scenic vista, which cannot be beat, right to Mount Mansfield, straight through the property. It's absolutely exceptional. Very excited to be a part of that. We also were involved. Casey's Hill. And we worked with Vermont Land Trust to conserve that land. It's not quite 9 acres. Scenic gateway to Mount Mansfield, absolutely spectacular. It's a traditional sledding hill every year. People come from all around to sled at Casey's Hill. The Tomasi Meadow, we added that in 2020, now owned by the town of Underhill as Casey's Hill is as well. We worked with the Vermont Land Trust to conserve Tomasi Meadow, named after the family. And it offers cross-country skiing, walking, it has a trail system, and of course it adds to the absolute scenic, spectacular view of Mount Mansfield. I consider it the gateway, scenic vista to Mount Mansfield. Mob's Farm, owned by the town of Jericho, that's a more recent project. Very excited to conserve town-owned land. That's probably 20 years of talking to the town of Jericho about why it's important to conserve town-owned land. There was a lot of pushback over the years not to conserve it and not to tie up natural resources, as the town might need that land for a number of different reasons looking into the future. But we were able to convince, along with the Jericho Conservation Commission, that this land should be conserved. And so it was 2022. And we've also worked with farms, and we're excited about that. That's more recent. We have Pecos Valley Farm. We received 280 acres in 2005. 90 of those acres is leased to Paul Mazza for vegetable growing. It also has a trail system. It has a small parking area, and the bulk of it is forest. We own it. The Barber Farm is privately owned. It abuts Pecos Valley Farm. 148 acres of protected land for agriculture. There is a trail easement, and as I mentioned, it's privately owned. It goes all the way back to, well, it's got a long history of farming. The farm upstream is rather recent, 3 families, young families coming together to purchase a historic farm called the Hunt Farm on Lee River Road. 52 acres conserved, and a whole lot of energy that is now being poured into an older farm family, and they're growing, these young kids, I call them kids, are growing great produce, and they've started a little farmer's market. The Davis Farm, more recently, conserved in 2024, and 181 acres of pasture. It's one of 2 dairy farms left in Jericho. They've been dairy farming for 3 generations, and it continues. The Riverside Meadow is an addition. We purchased that in 2022. It's 12 acres of hayfield, and it also precedes Mills Riverside Park, so it keeps that whole swath, that visual swath open, so it's not interrupted with housing. And then forest and wildlife habitat. We have the Wolf Run Natural Area, which we purchased in 2003 and conserved with the Vermont Land Trust. Primarily, we also have the state involved with holding an easement. And it is remote wildlife habitat. I don't know if you guys know Sue Morse, but she was very involved in helping us with fundraising for this project. She uses some of this land for some of her keeping track outings. So 403 acres of forest, very rugged trail. And then the Simpson property, which abuts Wolf Run. And that's just a kind of, as you were mentioning, Kate, part of the forest, unfragmented forest. And hundreds of other acres privately owned throughout Jericho and Underhill. And as I mentioned, none of this can happen. These miracles can't happen without strong support, strong community support, as well as a willing landowner who cherishes his or her property and would like to conserve some of it, and also a land trust being involved. In many cases, it's a full partnership of land trusts in a plural. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Livy. I just wanted to open up this time for questions. If anybody has questions or wants to hear more about certain aspects of
What we do.
these presentations, please.
Each of you can answer this, or whoever. Do you ever approach people that you say, oh, they've got a spectacular view and we should conserve it? Or is it always waiting for something to continue?
Good question.
I'll try that one.
Okay.
There are exceptions, but I have always found a different quality of listening when you make the approach as opposed to when the landowner makes the approach. And so I found it much more successful to wait, have the ideas out there. I think one of the
Could you give the question, what the question
Oh,
was?
okay. The question was whether does the land trust approach landowners, or does it wait till landowners come to the land trust? And I generally, unless the property's on the market, it's listed for sale. And there's certainly a whole number of examples where we, responded to that. But in a situation where, it's just a beautiful property and you'd love to see it conserved, do you approach the landowner? No, we generally wait. Now, the Nature Conservancy is different. They have a list of the most important natural areas, and they approach, the door gets slammed, and they approach again, the door gets slammed. And sometimes in the end, with persistence, it happens. But when the Housing Conservation Board got started and they put out their criteria, we didn't make a list of the 200 most important farms in Vermont. We just put the list out there, and we decided that every farmer in the state, whether their land was going to qualify or not, deserved to know, to have their farm evaluated and to find out, give them information. We spent a lot of effort on that. And then the best ones that came forward, and they were very competitive at the beginning, and they became more competitive over time. But that was the way we approached it.
Same.
How about you, Kate?
We generally never approach people. One reason being capacity. I mean, we're generally busy enough with people that approach us. And I should say too, keep in mind, more people approach us. We talk to more people about conservation than we will do projects with. And that's part of the education, is talking with people. It's sometimes a little bit of a hard conversation because someone has approached you about conserving because they feel so strongly about their land, and it doesn't necessarily always meet the criteria. So to start prospecting would be really more time than we have. Also, we have found, and you alluded to it, people get a little up in arms if they think they've been targeted. And so it's a delicate subject. It periodically comes up, oh yes, you should have your list, even if it's not public, of what you're interested in, but it can be a little dicey. And in a small town, we particularly try to be careful of that.
So this is held down. Why don't you give your question and I'll repeat it?
First, I want to thank you for sharing their information. It's exciting and informative. I have a question in the case of, for example, a farm where a young couple has gotten use of the land. When that family maybe ages out, how is that held in conservancy, and have you had a situation where that's happened already?
So the question is about what happens when the current owners of a farm either die off, they have no heirs, it goes to their heirs. What's the transition process?
I think the man you should ask is Al Karnitz, who worked with farm families for, almost 30 years now, for the Land Trust.
They have to.
I'm grabbing the,
Yeah.
anyway, I'm Al Karnitz.
Whoops, you just got off one.
Okay, try this again,
Yes.
or maybe not. Here we go.
I'm curious too.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I'm Al Karnitz. Darby hired me about 30 years ago at the Land Trust, and I work in the Champlain Valley doing farmland conservation. I was going to comment on your comment, the first question about do we ever approach people. I had a grant on a project that had a condition that said, we'll give you this money, but you also need to talk to the neighbor. And I thought this was a very strange condition. And so I did. I followed up on this grant condition because we wanted to conserve the neighbor's farm. And so I went to meet with the owner. And that was 30 years ago. We might be actually conserving his farm next year. So it can take a while.
Yes, it can.
But I think the question about what happens during transition time, we work a lot, about a third, I would say almost a third of my projects now have some kind of transition involved, if it's not conserved yet. In other words, conservation is part of that transition piece. And it's actually a very tender time, as you can imagine, for a family to say, okay, what's going to happen to our farm? And sometimes we can match that owner with a new farmer.
My question related to a farmer who's already farming on
Conserved land. Well, in that case, we actually can kind of do similar kinds of things. We can do sort of matchmaking, but obviously, they're free to sell it. We do have an option to purchase the property when it comes up for sale. We don't often exercise that option, but our plan would be to try to keep it in productive use. And we do have a list of people. We did this in Orwell on a farm recently where it was in the process of being conserved, and we helped match up a farmer with that. But they're free to sell the farm. They're free to sell the property. Whether we exercise our option to buy it or not is another question. But it's still, it's often a very marketable property. We see more farms being sold around the state now that are conserved than non-conserved. They're obviously going to be sold intact because that's the primary restriction, is you can't subdivide. But those are the properties that often rise to the top of that market for farmers. So I think there's still a strong market for those properties. I'm not sure I'm answering.
I'm not sure either.
You know what might be, because we do this all the time, we may not be, we may have jumped over something in there.
Sure.
Keep in mind, conservation easements go with the land.
Okay.
So that's the key, that may have been what we forgot to mention. So if a property transfers, that easement goes with it. And that's why conservation is so powerful.
So that makes it permanent.
It's a permanent restriction.
Right.
Thank you.
So the Charlotte Land Trust every first 2 weeks in July puts out red signs at every conserved property in town, and it says this land is conserved forever. And we have had people, lawyers usually, quibble with us on that forever. And I have gotten into more legal background that I never wanted to hear from some of them. But anyway, so the key thing to remember is, yes, all they said about transition is true, but the rock bottom piece is that easement does not change regardless of who owns the property.
Those signs are good advertising for land conservation. Yes,
They are. We had one lady come up to me once and said, every time I see those signs, I want to go up to those landowners, knock on the door and say, thank you.
One story, I knew the land conservation movement had arrived when there was an ad in, I think, the Addison County Independent that said 500 acres, beautiful views, roadside, this land is not in the land trust.
Another question back here, or you want to come up and do this?
I think I can talk really loudly. This is an embarrassing question, but it's a really newbie question. What is conserved land? I would imagine in the broad sense it means no development will happen on that land, but what does it mean in a more practical sense? Who pays the taxes? What does it mean when a farm is conserved? It means it will be farmed always, or it can't be developed in the future? And who, if the land trust owns the land versus it's privately owned versus the town owns it, what is the difference between all of that? What does that all mean in a practical sense?
Go ahead, take a crack at it. Go ahead.
I lost some of that.
Okay.
Penny.
Let me start. That's good. A conservation easement is simply a floor below which certain things are not allowed. Society allows most uses of land, but they set through zoning, Act 250, Health Department regulations, certain things that are not allowed. That would be kind of a floor on your use. The conservation easement moves that up. And it might move it up to forever wild, it can't do anything, or it might move on a farm, agriculture, forestry, recreation, certain kinds of businesses like farm stands. I think in general, a conservation easement allows, doesn't require, allows the things that have traditionally happened on that land. Agriculture, timber harvesting, recreation, education, habitat. But not, with a few exceptions, not required. There's a couple of exceptions I can think of where we were trying to maintain a view, so if the land was not hayed, at least had to be brush hogs overlooking Shelburne Bay in one case that I'm thinking but that's rare. And it may be that that farm field goes back into brush and into forest, but is still conserved. And if somewhere down the road, 100 years from now, society decides it needs that land for agriculture, it can be cleared and brought back into use. So it's permissive. And then usually there are several things there may be some provisions in there that allow some other uses, such as provision for 1 or 2 additional house sites in specific locations, or farm labor housing, or for a child or something. So those things are usually built in.
So what is the difference between a land trust owning land, the town, privately owned, who pays the taxes? Why would you want to conserve, if you're an owner of a property, why do you want to conserve it?
Well, that's when I was saying willing landowners as part of the miracle. It usually starts with the landowner's desire to see their land conserved, protected against development. But there's also the natural resources of the property, which is often incorporated into the conservation easements. So what's called the conservation values of the property, which could include wetland buffers, and it could include habitat and so forth, as purposes for conserving the land beyond prohibiting development. So as far as whether the town owns it or the land trust owns it, or I know for our property that the Jericho Underhill Land Trust owns, which we have a little over 800 acres, 2 large properties, we enroll it in state current use. We pay just like any other private landowner would, who's interested in keeping the land open, and it's a contract with the state. We have a forest management plan. A good portion of Wolf Run, which I'm showing you, actually is also enrolled in state current use, but it's under conservation, which is available to nonprofits. And I'm not sure, maybe it's now available to private owners as well. I'm not sure about that. But we pay taxes like any other large landowner would for the town of Jericho. And we did get pushed back early on. Some of the events you were referring to, they're still out there as far as if you conserve land, the grand list is going to come down, and that affects everybody. So we made a decision early on with the land that we own to pay taxes on it and not get into a nonprofit request at town meeting every 5 years to have taxes reduced or eliminated, so that we don't get into that argument about conserving land in the grand lists and so forth. The conservation easement, whether it's the town or whether it's private or whether it's the land trust, basically stays the same. You're doing the same thing. You're reducing development. You're keeping the conservation values of that property intact. And it's an agreement between the willing landowner, the land trust, the town, and it's a back and forth. There's a draft and another draft and another draft to make sure that the easement, which is kind of like a constitution, as you're mentioning, it's in perpetuity. It's very hard to know what farming is going to look like in another 50 years or 100 years. So if you make it too tight in language and say it can only be hay or something along those lines, who knows what farming is going to look like. So it's got to be broad enough to accommodate changes, but it also has to be tight enough to actually do the work of conserving the land.
I want to say one thing about landowner motivation, which is, for a lot of people, especially a lot of Vermonters, land is deeply a part of who they are, and it's part of their legacy. If you've worked a piece of land for 50 years, even if you're not a farmer, if you've been out, you care about that, and you care about what's going to happen after you're gone. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, and that's the motivation. Now, there may be, certainly there can be financial issues, both for you and for your heirs, and all those have to be thought through. But that's if you don't really care about that land, you're going to make more money selling it on the market.
Right.
And so that you talk to the land trust because you care about what's going to happen in most cases.
I'll just answer that as well, because I think maybe the other thing we may be missing, like you said, what's the motivation? in my world of doing farmland conservation, there's a pretty robust farmland conservation fund, which Darby mentioned, the Vermont Housing Conservation Corps. We get some federal money funding. So almost all of my projects involve a cash payment to the landowner. So if you're a farmer and you want to conserve your land, that's one of my first questions that I ask a landowner is, do you want payment? Are you looking for some kind of payment to restrict your property? And if not, they can gift those restrictions on, or we have a fund. Every year, over the course of quite a few years, there's between $5, $6, $7 million that Vermont uses to help conserve farmland around the state. So most of my projects, when I'm working with a landowner, they're getting compensation. They're getting $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, maybe $500,000 to permanently protect their land from development, from further subdivision. Is the primary restriction.
So it's an incentive. It
Exactly.
incentivizes.
Exactly, and most farms have debt, they have lenders, they can't give away their development rights essentially. But if there's some cash payment involved, then that makes sense.
But there's still an element of caring about what, because if you wanted to maximize your dollars off that piece of land, you would not sell it as one big block, which is what you're required to do if you work with Al and the Housing Conservation Board. You'd sell it in pieces. So there's some, it's appraisal, you get the appraised value, but it assumes you're selling everything all at once together. And so there's still an element of I care about what, I would like to see this stay a farm. Yes, the finances are really important. I've got to retire, have some retirement funding. I've got to pay off any mortgage or debts that I have, but there's still that personal caring about what happens to that land.
Tom?
Yeah.
Can you stand? We need it for the
recording?
The recording.
Okay. Yeah. My question is about the Vermont Land Trust. So the Vermont Land Trust may own some land. They may have some easements on privately owned land. And I would guess these easements and so on are specific to that land. There may be differences in different properties. So 5 years, 10 years, 50 years later, how does the Vermont Land Trust ensure that those easements are being observed? How do they know that some property isn't being divided up and sold in pieces? How do you enforce those easements?
Again, Al may want to give the current. You can monitor what happens on the land by satellite, and take a picture of it and compare it to last year and see whether something was.
Does the Vermont Land Trust do that?
We do.
We do, yeah. We used to do it at the beginning. We did it by airplane, and you didn't know exactly what you were photographing.
I'm familiar with that.
But the important part is back to this relationship. That if you are in touch with that landowner and you have a conversation about what they're planning and what you can provide and that sort of thing, then the chances of violation occurring or something happening without you knowing are diminished. They don't go away. And so the Land Trust tries very hard to have a one-on-one conversation with every landowner. That's not possible. But they have, probably it's over 90%, they have either a personal visit with the landowner or a conversation on the phone or an extended email. Now,
Once a year, yeah.
Once a year.
Every year.
Once a year, and more often if something comes up, if they have questions. And you're really trying to be helpful to that landowner. They say, oh, you want to build a new barn and it's going to be over here. Well, that's outside of the farm, says you need a permission, but this is what you need to provide us, and we'll make sure you get a quick answer on this. That site looks a little problematic. What about this site? Those sorts of things that are important. Staying out of the courts is really important for a whole bunch of reasons. So stewardship now is more about relationship building and maintaining
than it is simply monitoring. And occasionally you do have to go to court, but it's been very rare.
Want to come up? Bill?
I had kind of a question about, I didn't know the specifics of this arrangement, but like, I think it maybe was an estate where somebody actually left a piece of property to a land trust that then was, I think, sold. But I think it was to maybe generate funds to acquire maybe the easement rights for another piece of property. Does any of that kind of happen where you kind of shift conservation easements as far as like a prioritized piece of property where, say, like conservation easement was acquired for one property and then it was thought, oh, well, this is actually more priority, so we're gonna shift that. Does that occur?
It's the gift or a bequest of property, and usually, sometimes you get a bequest and you had no idea that it was coming, and you can't talk to the landowner. But then you make assumptions. What kind of property is this? Is it a beautiful open field? Is it a farm? Is it an important forest? Or is it a building lot somewhere? But usually you have an opportunity to talk with that landowner and say, you know, what is it you want? And they say, well, we want you to hold, the land trust to hold this forever. And I say, well, I don't think we can. We just don't have the resources to do that kind of thing. But we are willing to make sure that it's protected and conserved. And sometimes it goes to the town. I think of a swimming area in Calais where I lived. But often if it's restricted and resold, let's say it's a farm field, rather than our leasing it to a farmer and going through an annual lease, and if you transfer ownership, they become responsible for it, they pay the taxes, and you just monitor the easement to make sure they're observed. And so it really depends, and the land is usually given to the land trust without restrictions, so you maximize whatever tax benefit there might be. But you darn well better look after that and keep the faith on it, because that may be your last gift.
Okay.
So there's their real motivation.
Understood. So like an easement can't be like basically bought out.
No.
Okay. That was kind of my curiosity. Thank you.
So we have time for one
We've
more
had
question.
I bet you have.
Janet,
had her hand up for a long time.
Janet, you want to come up? Or actually, this one can come to you.
I appreciate hearing the history, and I'm thinking that we're in a similar time of the 80s with the pressure of housing and conservation, and see a lot of parallels. And I heard a number of you reference that when you conserve land, sometimes we can't know the uses. I just think about carbon credits and things that we never anticipated. So, Livy, when you were talking about the city owning the land, and you wanting a conservation easement, Jules wanted one on that, how did you present that to them? Were they thinking maybe this is a land bank that we should not put an easement on because we don't know what our town may need? So from South Burlington, we have similar kind of pressures and for development, and are wondering what kinds of things, conversations do you have to support them putting a conservation easement on city-owned land, and how did you get that to the finish?
It took almost 20 years.
Okay, so it was a long conversation.
Yes, it was a long conversation. I was on the Jericho Conservation Commission for 8 years ago, and the Mott's property had been purchased by the town of Jericho, actually as a landfill site.
Oh, interesting.
And so that was their purpose. And they bought it from the Mott's family in the early 80s. And it's a substantial amount of land. And over the many years, it became more and more recreational with trails. It's a destination site for mountain bikers, for example, walkers, dog, you name it, horses. It's well used, well loved. And over these many years, the Conservation Commission and the Jericho and Hill Land Trust, we pushed and pushed for the idea of it being conserved. We had a town administrator for 11 years who was very much against the idea, with the concern that we don't know what the future needs of the town will be. we may need it for this, or we may need it for that, or we could use it for that. And so he was very much against conserving it, and he had huge influence on the 3 select board members. So we visited with the select board, presented the idea, it stalled, we came back, we regrouped, we presented the idea to the select board, we lost, well, one of the select board members who was resistant to it stepped down. So out of 3 select board members, we got a 3rd select board member who was a little bit more open to the idea. It was a very long conversation, very long, but eventually the recreation and just the joy of having that land open, it's a mix of open fields and forest. A lot of wildlife habitat. Millbrook runs right through part of the boundary. It's beautiful. UVM Research Forest is directly across Tarbox Road, contiguous. There's a lot of good reasons why it should be conserved. And eventually the town agreed, the select board agreed, but put it to a vote at town meeting. This wasn't a simple decision. So it came to a vote at town meeting, and it was passed almost unanimously. So that's how that happened. And then with that approval of the townspeople, we worked with Vermont Land Trust, Bob Heiser in particular, to conserve a good portion of it. But it was long.
I think we're going to have to cut this off right now. We have some refreshments available for all of you. I think we should give these people not only a round of applause for giving this presentation, but for all the work they've done over all these years.